Hello and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Influencer and TurboTax. My name is Kevin Barefoot. I'm the Vice President of Business Development here at Teamworks, and we have a topic that is both timely and a topic that all of us probably wish we knew a little bit more about, which is taxes. And so we're excited to dive into today's webinar. And while we have some student athletes that are undoubtedly attending this is really designed to be an administrator's guide. So something where we can share important information and provide clarity to you as administrators so you can provide the right support and info back to your student athletes on your campus. We have a phenomenal panel today to provide some expert insights. And I would love if you all could do the introduction of each of yourselves. Kat, we'll start with you and maybe go down the line. Tell us who you are and where you're from.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Katharina Rickmans, but everybody calls me Kat. I'm an enrolled agent and tax expert with TurboTax. I'm from Florida, so it's nice and warm over here on the East Coast, and so glad to talk with everybody today.
Kat, we won't ask you to disclose like who your favorite team is. That passions run high.
Florida State. That's it. There's no other one. Go Noles.
Listen, I appreciate the honesty and passion. That's okay. Everybody's passionate about their own team. Colin, next up. What's going on, man?
Awesome. Thanks for having me today, Kevin. Colin Stoker. I'm the Assistant Athletic Director of Student Athlete Development and Name, Image, and Likeness here at Western Kentucky and Bowling Green.
And then Bridget, last but not least.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Bridget Perrine. I'm the Assistant AD of Talent Brand Management here at Clemson University. I oversee our NIL program.
Big time. Thank you all so much for joining us. Excited to dive in today. In terms of agenda for this webinar, we're going to be providing tax expertise from Kat and TurboTax. So we're going to be covering the basics of documentation and what information student athletes need, clarity on topics that we see a lot of questions about. Colin and Bridget are here to also provide some best practices from their campus, things that they've observed across the country that are working well. We are going to have some time for Q&A. So if you are watching this at the bottom right of the screen, there's a questions button that you can click on and type in your questions. We'll save some time at the end to do our best to answer those. And then we also have a few reminders. So there are some tools that are built in to the tech that we provide institutions. So if you're an influencer school, please definitely stay tuned, and we'll have some key reminders there for you. But no matter who you are, stay tuned to the end because we are going to have some links to resources that you and your student athletes can use. And then final housekeeping item, we are going to be sending a follow-up email to all of the folks that are in attendance or that have registered with a link to rewatch this. If you didn't get enough of us today live, you can rewatch it in the follow-up link and have access to those resources. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump right in and start talking some of the basics, kind of lay down the foundation as we approach really, we're deep in tax season already, but as we get close to April. Kat, let's start with you just on a few questions about what is actually taxable from an NIL perspective. And there's several bullets here. I'm going to hit the first two at once because these are probably the most obvious, and then we'll get into more of the nuance. But let's talk about W-2 income and NIL income for student athletes.
So W-2 income, I think most folks are more familiar with. Whether you're an athlete or not, they might have a part-time job, a summer gig, something where they're working for an employee. So they're going to get that W-2 at the end of the year with all their earnings. Or then what we're all here for is the NIL activities. So the monies or the income that they're earning from these NIL brand deals or activities.
And the next two are a little more nuanced. Product is one that, they're particularly early on in the NIL era, there wasn't as much clarity on, or for student athletes' perspective, there was some confusion on. But products that you receive, even if it's not cash or some form of payment, you have to pay taxes on those products. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing there.
So yeah, I almost even got myself caught up or jumped the gun, you could say, talking about that one already in the first example, because a lot of times these student athletes might not be receiving monetary, so like cash or a payment for their services, but they might get reimbursed in the sense by whether they've received free product or different, maybe a sponsored trip or a vacation, things like that. They can expect to even receive 1099s, which we'll get into a little bit later, for the value. So like the fair market value of that product or that vacation.
Yeah, and I've even seen student athletes that have gotten a country club membership to play golf, for example, or apparel or food. There's a lot of food that's being provided as NIL payments. Do you have any advice on how student athletes should calculate that fair market value? In other words, if I receive that country club membership to play golf, should I just look up what a typical membership would cost and kind of assume that is the fair market value?
Yeah, that's going to be one of the safest ways to go about it, is to, do your own research. But likely if the student athlete reaches, the threshold requirement, which is $600 or more for some of these 1099s, they'll likely could receive the fair market value already, equated for them, packaged up. But if they didn't and they still wanted to report it, like, hey, I got this, like you said, the country club membership is a great example, something you can look up and see what the going rate would have been had they got it on their own. That's a good way to get the fair market value of something, or like apparel, what it would normally cost to purchase that item.
Now, when it comes to institution specific examples, Austin money, scholarships, grants often come up. Talk to us a little bit about those, how those should be handled or viewed.
So generally speaking, these like grants and scholarships, when a student is receiving them, only the portion that's not used to pay for like qualified expenses is what would be considered taxable. Now, that might vary a little bit from student to student. So that's why I said it would be specific. And then it also sometimes depends on like their other income structure. So like, are they earning money from other sources that with that additional grant money or Alston money would require them now to like be at a filing threshold. So the general rule of thumb is to always report it, but the Alston money is not taxed before it's distributed. So that's also kind of like a nuance to some schools. And some schools don't even have that program or aren't awarding that type of educational grant or money, if you will. So generally speaking, scholarships and grants would not be taxable. But again, the portions that are not used for qualified education expenses, that excess would be the part that would be considered taxable.
And Colin and Bridget, to flip it over to you all from the campus perspective here, when you see these categories of taxable income on the screen, what are you all getting the most questions about? What categories tend to garner the most interest from student athletes or questions?
I can step in first. I'd say the biggest one is definitely in-kind opportunities. I think when we are even disclosing, a lot of them are still disclosing to $0. And so kind of getting them to think about the fact that, hey, it is the cost of the lease of the car, or it's the gift outright of the car, or whatever it may be. And the tax implications for that is definitely one of the things we're trying to hit home with our students.
And when in doubt, ask questions, right? A couple of schools made headlines for providing vehicles or collectives, I should say, providing vehicles to student athletes. And so that's one that should definitely be clarified. Do you own the vehicle? Is it a lease? What is the value of that lease, et cetera? Colin, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think the same thing that we're seeing here is a lot of products, less of those cash payments, but seeing a lot of products that our student athletes are receiving. And again, like you said, making sure that they understand what that fair market value is and properly reporting that within the app, I think is really important. And it helps, again, early on of setting that expectation of, again, it's not just a $0 transaction that you're putting in. And then us as administrators on the back end following up when you do identify through that compliance ledger that there is a $0 transaction, and following up with the student athlete and helping them get an understanding and us getting an understanding of exactly what they received so we can get that proper number reported.
That's a great point. Not that the responsibility falls on the staff to make these declarations to the IRS if you're a student athlete, but it's obviously helpful to have access to information so you can see what students are submitting and then be able to provide that appropriate guidance. I wonder what the fair market value of all those Barstool Sports t-shirts were that everybody got back in the summer of 21.
I
Let's
think
talk.
so.
Go ahead,
It's
Kat, go
also
ahead.
really important for them to just notice, and we'll like get into it further, but they're not paying taxes necessarily on all of what they've received. It's the net. So it's after they take away their expenses. So we're going to get into expenses a little bit further, but I wanted to like also call that out. So it might be not just as zero as they think, because maybe they commuted to get that product or something, or other expenses went into it. So we'll get into it a little bit later, but just to touch on that slightly.
It's a great point. It's the net. Documentation is obviously important. Most common tax forms received by student athletes, and then Kat, anything that we want to remind administrators of in the context of this documentation.
So let's just say high level, the most common form that they'll likely get from their NIL activities is probably a 1099 of sorts. Now, the most two popular 1099s that we're seeing at this moment for them would be the 1099 NEC, which stands for non-employee compensation, because they're not that employee like a W-2 would be produced. And then the 1099K. We've seen 1099K buzzing a lot because there's been a lot of legal changes or reporting requirements, if you will, and those thresholds have been, changing. So for this current tax year that we're in, it's not likely that your student athlete would have gotten a 1099K unless they had $20,000 in transactions and more than 200 transactions from a third party. So that's like if they were using a PayPal of sorts to get their money. Now, they may have gotten one because the threshold has been lessened, but it's still like in a transition period for this year and next tax year. So those are the payments from those third-party sites that are going to give a 1099K. Now, a 1099 NEC is more common, and it's what you'll just see if they've made more than $600 throughout the year, or $600 worth of, like we said, products or other types of incentives. So now these are going to report the gross totals. So it's going to report everything that they've received from them, but it's not going to take into account expenses, right? It's also less common, but a 1099 missed, so 1099 miscellaneous. You could also probably get that, and that would be maybe for like a one-off, a giveaway, or a prize or product. But typically within those, it's just going to give you the gross amounts that the students got before taking into account all of their expenses.
An early look at one of our key reminders is, for the administrators out there and for the student athletes, all of this transactional reporting can be pulled from Influencer and exported, right? So even as a student athlete, if to your point, Kat, I may not receive a 1099, or maybe I've misplaced it, which I'm not suggesting that 18 to 22-year-olds misplace documentation like this. But if they do, they can go to the Influencer app, and anything that's been disclosed through Influencer, they'll be able to export that. They can just sort by the tax year and then pull that information out. The other thing is, if you're a school watching this that uses the Influencer Exchange, which is that front-facing NIL marketplace where businesses, brands, collectives can connect directly with student athletes. One of the benefits of using that platform is we actually provide, through our partnership with Stripe, our payment platform, a single 1099 at the end of the year for student athletes. So if I did 4 deals with my collective and 5 other deals with individual businesses, should they amount to more than the threshold, Kat, that you mentioned, I will get one 1099 for everything that's come through Influencer. So a best practice is to try to push everything possible through there just for tax simplification. Kat, you alluded to it. Student athletes get a report on their gross income, and then they have the ability to deduct expenses. And this is something that I think probably was not taken advantage of early on in particular, and maybe still not by a lot of athletes. But let's talk about some of the expenses that student athletes can deduct.
Yeah, I think that it's great to call out the expenses. I think still, like you said, there are athletes that are unaware that some of the things that they're doing are considered a business expense for their NIL work. And I saw that a little bit at the NIL Summit. So the IRS is going to see a business expense for NIL, just like any other business. So it has to be something that is directly related to the business, and it has to be ordinary and necessary to whatever the work was. So nothing extravagant of the sorts per se, but as long as it falls in line with what somebody would typically need to do that line of work. So a really great example is going to be travel expenses. So right there, we posted the standard mileage rates. So that's how much per mile a student would be able to deduct for their NIL activity. So let's say they were traveling to a location where filming was going to happen for some type of social media ad. So if they were doing that, now that travel from their dorm or their home to this location, those miles they used, if they maybe went to multiple stops and they were driving. So that's one of them. That's a smaller one. But even larger, if they had to now go to a different state and they're traveling, that airfare, that lodging for where they stayed when the filming was taking place. So now it can't be excessive and, also stack on vacation days, but for the timing that they were there related to the NIL business, that flight would be a reimbursable expense. Now, even on a smaller level, if they are, creating content, let's say in their dorm room even, or on campus, they had to buy a ring light or a tripod, a microphone. Those are some common expenses that would be directly related to their NIL deal or brand deal business, because they wouldn't be able to produce the level of content without that tripod, without the ring light. So those are common expenses that, student athletes may be leaving on the table because they don't realize, well, I did get it to do my deal, so I can deduct it.
Let me double click on that, because that third bullet's an interesting one. When I think about something like a tripod or a ring light, technically, I may use that for something not related to a monetizable NIL deal. How does TurboTax or the IRS kind of define what is ordinary and maybe directly related to that NIL activity? Because some of these things can be used in other applications as well, or for personal use.
Yeah. So I think a good example of where you're maybe sharing some of the expense with your personal and your business, a common example is your cell phone, right? So a lot of the times the students would not be able to book these brand deals and whatnot if they didn't have access to the apps or things they need to on the phone. So now, because the cell phone is likely also used for personal, you can't deduct the entire cell phone bill, but maybe equate a percentage of it. Like half of the time I'm on my cell phone is related to work or brand deals, then a percentage of that. The same would apply to if they paid for, some type of internet service because they were working from their computer. So really defining and, not being, I guess, too generous, but realistic. Like what percentage of it do you use? Now, I think sometimes you might hit a best of both worlds, that maybe you purchased something that was directly related to what you were putting on at the time, and it was necessary for that maybe you needed a shelf to put, the products on that you were showing in your video. So you did buy that for a business, and maybe later down the line, you get lucky and that shelf serves another purpose for you, but its intention was that it was purchased for the use of your business. So I think when in doubt, that's when the tax experts come in handy and can help you weed through it. That's why TurboTax having live experts that can help you is a great plus. But I think just really keeping in mind and keeping track of them throughout the course of it, and not trying to go backtrack. Now, what did I buy for that first deal? So receipts on the other end, taking pictures of what you spent, screenshots. I think throughout the time, instead of going backwards, you might find yourself even missing things because you didn't remember what all went into it ahead of time, especially mileage or things like that.
Yeah, that's a pro tip for sure that administrators should be sharing with athletes, is that any of those expenses that you anticipate deducting, you have to have receipts for, because as somebody who's had an IRS audit at one point in the past, you got to have all those receipts, all that paperwork, and if you're organized on the front end, it makes it a lot easier. Colin, how about you from a campus perspective? Are you all, when you think about expenses, what's the tenor among student athletes? Are they aware of these deductible expenses? What are you all getting questions about? What are you advising them on?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lack of awareness is definitely a thing, and helping our student athletes who are really diving into creating content and having opportunities like this, especially as we work with our younger student athletes, getting them to think again, not having to backtrack and kind of recover some of this information, and that if they're having this kind of full plan as they're attacking NIL, that this needs to be a part of their tool belt of remembering these things, and as they work through their process of creating content and really diving into NIL. We talk about NIL as we need to give it just as much love if we're going to be successful in it as we give our practice and our work in the classroom, that it's an additional piece of our life that we have to treat that way. We have to give it love, and remembering to do small things like this that will benefit you down the road when you're filing your taxes and when you're looking at your financial education there. I think is really an important reminder, especially again for those younger student athletes who maybe have not dove into NIL but want to get started, giving them some tools on their tool belt to be ready to go as they dive into it.
Bridget, how about you all? Are you all fielding a lot of questions about expenses, or what are you seeing at Clemson?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are definitely fielding a lot of questions. I think with the broad variety of NIL opportunities that there are, whether it's entrepreneurial in nature and you're doing a speaking engagement, so you're driving and you're getting a hotel, or you are kind of more in the creator economy space. And, what can you write off in that space? I think, we get a lot of questions of, can I write off my highlights? Can I write off my makeup? Can I, getting a haircut before an appearance? Like, are those things that you can? Last year, the answer was no. Not sure what the answer is this year, but kind of just keeping them thinking about, okay, well, where can I write off these expenses is just kind of keeping it top of mind.
I remember like early in my career, I was thinking about, can I even write off dry cleaning, right? Like I'm writing off the dry cleaning of the suits that I'm wearing. And it seemed logical because it seemed like a direct expense. In fact, you cannot do that. So when in doubt, seek expert advice.
And just, Bridget, that was hilarious that you said last year it was not. This year, it is still not.
That's why they're the expert.
Yeah. And I think that also, Kevin, to your point as well, like the tax law is always changing, right? So there was a time where folks could, get certain deductions related to uniforms or dry cleaning. And with like tax reform and different changes, we've moved away from that. But it is a common misconception, Bridget, like, oh, well, I bought this sweater, so then it is a business because I wore it to the thing, but not necessarily because you would wear that sweater outside and isn't exclusive. Now, if a content required them to maybe dress like a clown or some type of caricature and then like bust out of that into the interweavings of themselves, then yes, the clown suit, it's not expected that you would really have another use for it. And it was probably exclusively bought with the intention of this. You're not going out to dinner in that later. So I think that helps clarify. But yes, when in doubt, ask an expert, because every deal is so different. It's not, in tax situation, it's not going to always be a one size fits all answer.
Last bullet there, just miscellaneous expenses. You had an example of an agency fee. Can you just unpack that example a little bit?
Yeah. So these folks, sometimes you've gotten to the point where maybe you're not managing it all yourself, or you're paying for a fee or a service. So if you have an agency fee or some type of managerial or like an app or account fee, those type of things you might not immediately associate with like a business expense, but why else would you be paying for a certain app to help you manage your NIL? Or if you pay an agency directly, maybe they help you procure deals. So those are directly related to the income you earn. So you could deduct that as well.
So in the spirit of helping athletes prepare, this is a list of, the information that student athletes will need. One like in the middle of this webinar programming note is that we'll have a link at the end to a resource center for TurboTax or on TurboTax's website. And a lot of the blogs and articles there are specifically geared towards self-employed folks. And so student athletes would really fall as a 1099 contractor under the same rules that someone who's self-employed would. So great resources that we can provide for you at the end of this. But Kat, talk to us about any headlines from this list. A lot of this is stuff we talked about, 1099, W-2. If you get into like 1098s and then prior year? Any headlines here that administrators should know to take back to athletes?
At this point in the tax year, so we're like end of February, it's likely that the students should have already received everything by end of January, if not trickle in the beginning weeks of February. So they should have already received all the 1099s, any W-2s, any 1098Ts or Es from education or school purposes. They likely need some information from prior year tax return, and then receipts like we just discussed in the previous slide. It's way easier if you've been tracking them throughout the year than now to work backwards and say like, hey, I need all my receipts. The likelihood of getting audited, fortunately, is like really small, but that's what's going to save you if you do find yourself in that situation.
Don't tell them that. Don't tell them that, Kat. Don't tell them that.
Okay, but we don't want you to be scared of it, because folks automatically think like, I don't want to go to jail for this or anything. So yes, be honest and truthful to avoid those type of situations. But one stands out that Kevin mentioned that I think, student athletes and even folks earning 1099 income, because they might get them from like if they drove for a ride share, let's say in the off season or over the summer, they might get a 1099 for that. And it might be hard for them to wrap their head around being self-employed, because it sounds like such a big word, like I'm employing myself. But yeah, you're earning income as a business through your name, image, and likeness, but as yourself. So these 1099 income, generally speaking, is considered how self-employed would. So like Kevin said, on the blog site, we cover a lot of topics for self-employed. There are some topics directly for NIL folks, speaking to the parents, speaking to the athletes, speaking to you administrators. You'll find that type of content, but just want to call out like making sure they get everything in order when you're ready to sit down, so that it can be a breeze from like start to finish, having all your documents. And then social security number. I know that I personally did not learn mine to memory until my freshman year of college. So I think it's very normal for the kids not to have their social security card, but just want to call out like they will need the number. It's likely on maybe some other tax documents they've received, but that's also an important call out. But just having everything together when you're ready, I think would make it seem less of a struggle to get done.
Sure. And Bridget, social security number is something in particular I don't know I've heard you talk about. It's something that you got to remind kids to be prepared with.
Absolutely. A lot of them, their parents still have their social security cards at home in a lockbox. And so we did an on-site kind of VITA program partnership last year at my previous institution, and they actually required having the physical cards. And so figuring out if you're hosting some type of an event, what do the student athletes actually need to bring with them? Another big thing is those 1099s often get sent to their parents' address, or kind of that address that they have on file with them. And then my biggest thing is also, have the student athlete determine whether or not their parents are claiming them as dependents on their taxes. Kind of knowing that information going into tax season is super helpful for them as well.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that a 1099 employee has to do, certainly student athletes have to do, is set aside money for taxes. You get a gross amount, an untaxed amount from a collective or a local business. Colin and Bridget, we're going to have Kat give us the technical answer here. Do you all have, Colin, I'll start with you. Is there like a rule of thumb that you generally share with athletes on withholdings?
Yeah, we usually start with 30%. Is about the number that we ask our student athletes to put back. Be mindful of it. I think a lot of them start with the assumption that, hey, I have all this money ready for me right now. But I think the 30% number gives that comfortable window. Obviously, Kat can talk more about what the exact is there, but it gives them a comfortable wiggle room if something were to come up, and being prepared to pay the taxes on that money.
And then Bridget, it's easy enough for us to say set aside 30%. It's hard sometimes for student athletes to actually do that. How are you communicating the importance of setting that money aside? Is it just constant reminders? Are you all giving examples of people that have gotten in a bind in the past? How do you underscore the importance of that for your student athletes?
We have not gotten to the point of making an example of anybody. I hope to not have to get to that point, but really just kind of continue to stress like, hey, 25 to 30%, set it aside now. Worst case scenario, you can buy yourself a new pair of shoes or a fancy dinner. Use that money to treat yourself, but you'd rather be prepared when that day comes instead of you're hustling on the back end to try and make it up for the previous year.
it's always nice when you get that, you have a little leftover money at the end of tax season, which is a pleasant surprise. Kat, anything on the technical aspect of this? We have a sub bullet there talking about the net income, right? So if I set aside 30% of my income, my expenses can offset that. And so I may not need that full 30%. Any other thing you want to share here just on the kind of the technical answer of withholdings?
Well, I definitely want to give Colin and Bridget kudos because I think that 25 to 30% is definitely fair. And if the students are keeping it of their gross money because they're not maybe thinking about all the expenses that they had, that also gives them a little bit of extra wiggle room. It's hard to say exactly without looking at their full tax picture, of course, but I think that 30% is, generous. And I think that it's also important for administrators to help drive home for students because sometimes they're like, okay, I got a deal for $1,000. Like now I owe taxes on $1,000. So it might not be $1,000 if they've been keeping track of those receipts and all that went into it, because then like helping them see the difference between net and gross income, I think sometimes kind of goes over the student's head. So it's important to know that all these reportings are going to have gross. They don't know all the expenses that went into that student earning that income. So I think just the receipts, I always want to drive home, like keeping the receipts because it's going to help you, because it's very hard to remember next year what you were doing last year, especially if it was in the beginning half of the year, like now.
No doubt. There are a lot of free expense apps that exist as well, like just in terms of information for administrators to share back with their athletes. There are free apps that your student athletes can download, and they just take a picture of the receipt, type in, a couple of notes about the expense, and then all that is accessible at the end of the tax year. And that can be a much easier way than trying to keep up with an envelope full of paper receipts.
Same with mileage. Like you could use an app to track the miles if you're going to be doing some driving for your NIL. They'll just like click the button to turn it on. You started, click it to turn it off. I think any ways that administrators can help the students make it more seamless, it's going to seem like less of work for them.
Absolutely. So let's pivot. Kat, phenomenal information there. Thank you for, kind of the expert vantage point. But we want to talk also, about best practices from campus, and Kyle and Bridget want to get, insights from you all. Let's talk, Kyle, and I'll start with you, man, and just talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you all are doing at WKU for educational purposes for student athletes.
Yeah, so we start on day one. Within the first week of either our student athletes returning to campus in the summer or that first week in August, we have an NIL, call it our onboarding meeting. This meeting includes everything from personal branding, opportunities to work with NIL stores, some different things there, but smack dab in the middle of it, we talk about taxes, and we talk about that expectation of setting money back. And the different forms and things that they can receive throughout the year. So we set that expectation on day one that, hey, you're going to have to pay taxes. We need to be aware of it. We need to be saving money as we work through these different opportunities as they pop up. And we have that meeting because we've built that trust with the coaching staff. So usually we have one coaching staff member sitting in two. So we have an advocate within the team, and then we're that extended member of the team as well throughout the year, reinforcing that message. But then we kind of follow that up. My staff, we try to make every team make one practice a week from everyone, whether it's just to stop in, say hi. Sometimes it's not even saying anything. It's just being in the space as hey, there's that guy, reminder on some NIL tax stuff there. But then sometimes we ask for maybe 5 minutes after practice. This past week, stopped in with the baseball team and just gave some reminders as we're in tax season and as they enter their season as well, when more opportunities might be opening for them as they start that home schedule, to just be thinking and being aware of those things. And again, it goes back to just as much as we're giving love to our sport and our academics and different things, making sure that we don't let this fall behind, especially as we enter into season.
And then, Bridget, I know one of the things that you all are doing is funneling communication through coaches. How are you doing that? How's that been received?
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely, touch with our student athletes, make sure they're aware of their tax obligations, but also just from an interfacing perspective, knowing that their coaches, their academic advisors, their student athlete development contacts, like they interface with them, quite frankly, more than I do on a day-to-day basis. And so sending those constituents a list of, hey, here's who's getting a tax implication this season. Just make sure they're aware of, hey, you have to disclose, you have to make sure you're reporting to the IRS. But also, hey, here are the free resources available to you in the upstate, just as another touch point. And then obviously my office is right down the hall from both of those teams. And so very easy to kind of get back in front of those student athletes and have follow-up conversations.
And then are you all doing anything like mass communication? I know, some schools that you use Teamworks Hub, for example, or, having news feed, putting tax information in the news feed or sending out blast messages. Are you all doing anything like on a consistent monthly, quarterly basis in terms of mass communication?
Yeah, we are. So we use the Teamworks platform for a lot of different communication with our student athletes. We send kind of just an overarching, hey, tax obligations for all United States citizens, just kind of making them aware of what resources are available for them during tax season, but then just kind of overarching. And then we actually utilize the influencer kind of compliance dashboard to get a further list of who has disclosed over that $400 threshold to kind of send them reminders throughout the year as well. Just kind of, hey, you've hit this threshold. Please keep in mind that you are going to be, disclosing your taxes to the IRS, obviously, but then also you're going to have a tax implication on that as well. So just kind of keeping it front of mind, like we've talked about, and make sure they're aware of kind of what that's going to look like.
So we in the spirit of, ongoing communications, you mentioned pulling information out of influencer. Bridget, you were kind enough to actually share, I think, one of the templates that you all use for your communication here. I know this is what you're referring to. Any other things that you may want to share? And Colin, I'll come to you next, just about like your experiences in communicating to the masses, communicating with coaches, any other best practices related to information sharing among the team.
I think just have the resources available, equip the people that are interfacing with the student athletes with the necessary information, knowing that not every school has an NIL person on their staff, but who can answer the questions when they come up, knowing that they are going to come up. It might not always be from a football player that's earning X amount of money. It could be from a student athlete that's earned a lot just through trade deals. And so anybody that, in my opinion, is going to be interfacing, so that's a lot of our obviously senior staff, but then also just administrative components, director of operations, anybody like that, making sure they have all the information to be successful when those conversations do arise.
Colin, how about you?
Yeah, I think that, again, continuing with the communication, we use Teamworks a lot. We use actually the NIL checklist. I think that was provided by Influencer and TurboTax. We made sure that all of our student athletes had that. And then we also placed some within common team spaces as well. So just having somewhere where our student athletes are, again, in that consistent spaces, and giving the opportunity to make sure that just it's always top of mind and reminding them. And then, like Bridget said, making sure that we have the key constituents on each team that we know are consistently communicating those messages when we might not be able to be there on a day-to-day basis. And then just echoing that education and ongoing help that we're trying to provide.
Are there any current gaps? I'm going off script here, Bridget and Colin, so forgive me in terms of the topics we were going to cover. Are there any current gaps that you see, any things that you all are currently trying to solve for, or creative ideas? Or do you feel like, as we sit here in early 24, you've kind of got a good rhythm communication-wise and a good checklist of things you need to be doing?
At first, I thought you were asking about NIL at large, and I said, I don't think we have the time to kind of unpack that. I feel like we're in a good cadence when it comes to tax season. I think, my first year in NIL, I think there was a lot of questions, but I think it's enough of a conversation now that everybody understands that there's some type of implication. And so it's more getting them to understand that you're not necessarily going to know what that looks like until the following April, but planning for it ahead of time. And just that rainy day fund kind of concept has kind of been the biggest thing, but they're learning. It takes a little bit of time, but we're definitely getting there.
Now, international student athletes are certainly a category of athletes that there's been a lot of questions about early. Frankly, for a long period of time, it was a gray area. Would love to hear your all's input on, how you are establishing the facts around international student athletes and how you're communicating with those international athletes.
Yeah, so kind of where we're at, the one opportunity that our international student athletes have had open to them is working through Campus Inc. and the NIL store. We have guidance from our general counsel that said as long as a passive income opportunity, and I know sometimes determining what passive is difficult there, but in ensuring that that's the one opportunity open. But again, just with some like general tax issues as well. We've had to work we've got student athletes right now working with someone from New Zealand and some from Argentina and a couple different groups there, just trying to make sure that we utilize the resources that we have on campus to make sure that those student athletes are taken care of, and through the understanding of the different international treaties. And I'm not a tax expert, and I obviously it's been difficult in some aspects, but we use the third bullet point down there. Athlete Advantage has been a fantastic group for us, based out of Lexington, that has helped us get some just guidance and making sure that our student athletes are taken care of, working with our on-campus international office, and our other resources that we have for our student athletes to, again, making sure that we're providing that full suite of services to our student athletes to get them the most help that they can.
Kat, talk to us about Sprint Tax.
So Sprint Tax and TurboTax have a partnership, and Sprint Tax would be where I would recommend for like international students that, want help, or non-resident students with their taxes. So the code included here that you can scan, it sends them directly to the link to file and create an account with Sprint Tax, but it would be a resource that I would suggest, as like TurboTax directly is not as equipped to help them through their situation, but Sprint Tax would be able to help them navigate that as international athletes.
Love that. And that's really the goal here, right? Is we want to just continue to have these conversations, provide resources, ensure that everybody's as prepared as they possibly can be. Bridget, 2.5 years in, are you feeling more comfortable about international student athlete questions than you were a couple of years ago? What have you learned?
Absolutely. I think it's kind of different on every campus. I definitely have seen that. I think if your GC is conservative, kind of what you're even allowing as passive income. So it's a big conversation that we're having here even currently. But answering their questions to the best of our ability, the biggest thing is you're doing the work wherever your feet are. And so even if you're posting on social media and it doesn't feel like, a retweet doesn't feel like work to you necessarily, it still is considered work in the eyes of the government. And so helping them kind of understand what that actually looks like. I do not get into the weeds of the international taxes as much. We have a different crew over here on campus that helps with that, but continue to educate them is obviously the biggest piece for us.
And I think one of the early themes that has continued through NIL is, if you as an institution, just partnering with the resources that you have on campus, whether that be the law school to seek, legal advice or guidance, or your business school from an accounting or finance perspective. So we see a lot of that continuing. Let's bounce. The question queue has lit up here, or lit up. So let's bounce into a couple of these questions. And we'll see if we can direct them to the right folks. Kat, this is a question for you. Can the cost of the actual tax preparation be written off as a part of a person's business expenses?
Yes. So I think that is a great question. And there's probably some confusion around it, because prior, even if you were an individual, you could, deduct that. But as it pertains to the student athletes and those folks who are self-employed, yes, you can deduct the actual cost of the tax prep. So what they paid to do their return. Now, it wouldn't apply for like a regular, W-2 folk maybe who are just trying to write off. No, you couldn't. But for the student athletes, yes, as their self-employed income, it could be considered a business expense.
Question from Derek here. What advice for student athletes who have not received 1099Ks due to not earning $20,000? The 1099s that are provided through Stripe are 1099Ks because it is coming through a third party payment. So it is not direct from business to athlete. It is coming through Stripe. And so they would actually get a 1099, even if it was less than $20,000. Derek, good question. Let's see.
I think that it's also, he asked, there was a second part, but yes, like if it's, I guess the confusion with that is your advice for students who are not getting one, even because they haven't entered those thresholds, you should report any income that you make. So even if it's below the 20,000 or 600, so you're not getting a 1099, yes, you are required to always report the income. Now, that doesn't mean they'll necessarily have to pay taxes. That'll depend on the rest of their tax picture. But even though they're not, and that's where I guess Influencer is going to share that tip, pulling in the report of what they have. So in case they don't reach those thresholds.
Perfect. Thank you for the clarification, Kat. We had a question from Justin. Can you discuss specific technical resources and services available to student athletes through the Influencer and TurboTax partnership? In the coming slides, we're going to have QR codes to those resources, so stay tuned. That is definitely coming. Let's see. Can international student athletes participate in the new EA Sports game? That's one that I'm going to defer to the experts on this panel. So do you want to have insights on that one? Because that's a great question.
I don't have an insight for you. I definitely would rely on your campus's general counsel for kind of their recommendation. And then obviously, I think part of it's on the student athlete and their comfort.
Cool. Excellent. Let's see. I'm just reading through these questions here. Kevin mentioned early on that students may have only reported gross income and not deducted expenses related to their NIL work. Can they go back and amend their taxes if they missed deductions or credits that can help their tax situation? So if I, maybe Kat, last year forgot to include applicable expenses, can I go back for a redo? I think is the question.
Yeah. And even if it was within this tax season, it's not lost. You can go and file an amended tax return if there was something you forgot, or maybe income you received, you jumped the gun, you filed too early and you got it later. Then yes, you can go back and amend the return. If there were expenses, you just claimed the gross amount. It likely would make a difference for the student. I think on that same topic of going back and also filing, Bridget mentioned that, students knowing if they're claimed as a dependent or not. So sometimes a student might be claimed as a dependent and they maybe just had a W-2 job even, let's say, and just part-time, not enough to make them required to file. You can go back because like the IRS reports over $1 billion of refunds that go unclaimed because folks just don't know that they're there. And college students find themselves in that loop like, oh, I just worked a small part-time job or summer job. So no, and they can find that maybe they get any taxes that were withheld back to them. So you could go back and file a tax return if you hadn't, or if you did file one to this example and made a mistake, or you didn't claim expenses, you just reported the gross totals and stepped away, you could go back and file an amended return.
Excellent. We're 50 minutes in, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Questions are still coming in. If you have typed a question that we did not get to, then we will respond after the fact with answers to those questions. If it is an influencer or teamwork specific question, we can respond back to that. And then if not, we can also direct it to the appropriate folks. A couple of just general helpful reminders as we close out here are that, number one, all influencer student athletes can receive a discount on doing their taxes through TurboTax. And that discount code is available in the app. So there's a little video here on the right side, and that's in the Influencer app. Video on the right side. My question, Kat, for you here on this as we watch this video, there are different tax filing options: basic, deluxe, etc. Any guidance on which service student athletes should sign up for? How do they know what package they need from TurboTax?
You can start a little bit more, I don't want to say basic is the word, but start at the entry level once you create your account. It's going to ask you questions that's going to maybe suggest a product that it would think you need based off what documents you have, or as you go through it. It kind of also depends. Do you want to do more of a do-it-yourself and kind of answer the questions? Or would you prefer to just meet with a tax expert and kind of like hand over what you have and get it done within that meeting? So it's also a preference style in it as well. I wouldn't say, you're limited to either option, kind of like what you feel comfortable with, and if maybe you have some questions that you would want answered by a tax expert.
Beautiful. Key reminder number 2, and this actually goes to one of the questions that we got in the chat. When any transactions that come through the influencer exchange, and that could be the school-specific exchange or what we call the global exchange, which are third-party partnerships that we have, will receive a single 1099 that encompasses all those transactions. At any point, though, a student athlete can export their information and their NIL transaction history from influencers. So if they just wanted to set a date parameters from January 1 to December 31st, they'll be able to see all their transactions and pull that information directly from influencers, so we can continue to be a resource for student athletes. We got a couple of questions about this checklist. Colin, you mentioned it earlier, but this is a QR code that you can scan. This is a document that we created in partnership with TurboTax that is just a nice checklist for administrators to be able to review themselves, but also to share with student athletes. So I'll set this up. I'll leave this up for another few seconds just to make sure that everybody's able to scan it. Colin, Bridget, while we're allowing that to happen, any other, as we begin to wrap here, and I do have one more resource that I'm going to share after this question, so you got to stick around for that. Colin, Bridget, any other thoughts, closing information that you may want to share about, taxes in the context of NIL that you've experienced on your campus? Any other parting shots?
I think just continuing to emphasize the importance with our student athletes. I think the point that I took from the NIL summit last summer was there's a difference between your coaches yelling at you, punishment, me coming and yelling at you at practice, versus the IRS. And the IRS, you can be fined, you can be put in jail, and not to be scary there, but I think that point really resonates with our student athletes in that initial meeting, and the difference between something small that can happen on campus and the financial implications of not being on top of your taxes and understanding what's happening. So I think just continuing that, starting with an expectation and then following up throughout the year to make sure that our student athletes are on top of it.
Yeah,
Bridget, how about you?
I think that's a huge one. I'd also just kind of say, we're not tax experts. I'm not a tax expert on my campus, anything like that. And so I couch everything in education, right? I am reading the blog posts on TurboTax. I am asking the questions and figuring out the answers as well as anybody. But at the end of the day, I'm not giving tax advice. I'm not giving legal advice. And so, if they have specific questions, they need to reach out to an expert to get those answered.
Great advice. This is the link that I referenced earlier for folks to scan. This will take you to a list of resources on the Intuit TurboTax Tax Center website. And so as Kat mentioned, we have there is content on there specific to NIL. There's content on there that is specific to self-employed folks, which most student athletes would be considered that, or many would be considered that. So this is another great resource for you all to check out. We got a question earlier from Letitia that says, Tracy, may I get a transcript of this webinar? Yes, we will have a transcript of the webinar that we will be sending back to everyone who attended. But, as we wrap here, I want to thank, everyone for attending. I especially want to thank Colin and Bridget for taking time out of your busy schedules and joining us today to share perspectives from campus. And then Kat, thank you on behalf of Teamworks and Influencer as well. TurboTax has been a phenomenal partner of ours for a long time, and everything from providing education-related resources to student athletes to actually providing discounts on getting your taxes done. So thank you so much for you all for joining and being part of it today. And then, if you are watching this and you are an influencer school, and you have some follow-up questions, maybe that are product related, you can contact your customer success manager. And then if you are watching this and you do not have influencer, then you can contact, us. Joe Maggio is our influencer account executive that would be happy to answer any questions you have about how it works and, how we can provide these resources to your student athletes as well. Kat, I gave Colin and Bridget an opportunity for a last word. Anything from you as we wrap up?
Just reminding the student athletes to keep track of the receipts. I'm always going to drive that home because you don't want to leave any money on the table. And also, if you haven't claimed those receipts like somebody asked and you didn't, definitely go back and file the amended return. Maybe there's something owed to you that you haven't gotten. And then I think Bridget and Colin, best practices for administrators, not over advising, I guess. There's a lot of resources online. TurboTax tries to cover a lot of the things we think matters to NIL folks in this space. So just use those resources, and the Creator Tax Center is a great spot to direct kids when in doubt.
Again, thank you all so much for joining. To our panelists, thank you for your time and contributions here. This has been super helpful. Hope everybody has a great rest of their Tuesday and a great rest of the week, and we'll see you soon. Thanks a lot.